Mega Man & Base is a game that people often say is one of the worst games in the Mega Man franchise for being too difficult. Mega Man X6 is also a game that people often say is one of the worst games in the Mega Man franchise for being too difficult. I feel like these games, at least for the purpose of this video, don't need much more introduction aside from that. Plenty of people have already shared horror stories about how aggravating of an experience both of these games are, and upon first glance, it might sound like these two games have the same issues. Going into them, you might expect the same set of problems in both. Bad enemy placement, cheap deaths, platforming that expects too much from the player, the works. If you ask me, however, these elements are only scratching the surface, and both games have a lot more to discuss when it comes to their difficulty and overall design. Which one do I think is superior overall? Well, in case you're not able to guess, let's find out. Before we get into the games proper, I'd like to bring up that according to the Mega Man Official Complete Works page 97, Keiji Inafune had actually intended for Mega Man & Base to be as hardcore as possible. With that in mind, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect the game to be hard, would it? So far, I'm not aware of any source that says the same for X6. In fact, the most Inafune had to say about it in the OFC was that he owes the fans an apology of all things. As far as we know then, the game may not have been intended to be particularly difficult at all. If I'm wrong about that, let me know. Really, the average unsuspecting player picking up X6 after playing one of the previous X games would probably expect it to be roughly the same in terms of fair challenge, but I'll leave you to guess whether or not that's actually the case. Maybe you could say the same thing about Mega Man & Base since not everyone owns or has thoroughly read the Complete Works book. I mean, even I don't own it and only got this info from a page scan online. But the proof that the game was meant to be a tough case is there nonetheless, which is more than I can say for X6. But official sources aren't everything, right? Let's just assume that both games were intended to be extremely difficult. How well does each game affirm to this supposed goal? First we have Mega Man & Base, and I must say, the game definitely bears its teeth from the word go. As early as the intro stage, the game has platforming sections that new players could die once or twice to and pits you against the Green Devil at the end, and the rest of the game follows suit with some real tough Robot Master stages. Every one of the 8 main stages in the game has sections that will test your Mega Metal, be it having to platform on breakable ice sheets suspended over spikes, having to hop off rising platforms because they thrust you into spikes, doing with drill robots that destroy the ground from beneath your feet, and those are just the stages available from the start. By beating them, you unlock the remaining Robot Master stages, and they follow up by being even harder. Okay, Pirate Man's stage isn't too difficult, but there are still several legitimate challenges within, like Gabriel's on every other surface. Every single Robot Master boss fight is also very tricky with fast patterns that require concentration and reflexes to avoid. Even Cold Man, who is often considered to be the easiest Robot Master in the game, requires concentration since you have to juggle jumping over ice towers with disposing of this Moku Mokumo guy before you can inhibit your movement. Using the right special weapons does make the bosses easier, just like with every other Mega Man game, but they don't always completely eliminate the entire challenge of the boss fight. Spamming Ice Wall on Burner Man, for example, isn't going to win you the fight. Instead, you have to wait until he uses his Wave Burner move and then use the Ice Wall to push him into the spikes. This is fine by me since this stage is unlocked only when you beat Cold Man. While some stages and bosses are definitely easier than others, the point still stands that most of this game's content is challenging to get through. X6, on the other hand, is far less consistent with its difficulty. Some stages in this game are surprisingly easy to overcome right from the start, such as Amazon Area and Laser Institute. The only section of either of these levels that I would consider remotely formidable is this one part of Amazon Area where there are moving caterpillar rides traveling across a bed of spikes. Granted, it's only difficult because the camera doesn't pan down to show you where the next transport is, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Other stages, however, are a lot more difficult without the right equipment. Recycle Lab's entire gimmick is an instant kill hazard, a big compressor that moves up and down and can crush you instantly if you're not careful. This stage gave me a lot of trouble on my first recorded run thanks to the use of spikes and enemies that halt you in your path. Magma Area is practically a lost cause for a first pick thanks to this one section where you have to defeat a mini-boss while avoiding instant kill purple magma. Unlike MM&B, all 8 Maverick stages are available right after the intro stage, which makes it even more perplexing why the difficulty changes so much. This difficulty disparity also seeps its way into the boss fights. Someone like Infinity Maginion is really hard when you don't have the proper tools, but only because he likes overcrowding the screen with his own copies and gelatinous green bubbles. Other guys like Commander Yamark and Blizzard Wolfang can be mindlessly brute forced by repeated use of your Buster or Saber, not even just their weakness weapons. All of this is a bit disappointing when you consider Mega Man is like the one platformer series that gets boss fights right. The bosses in the last stages are in a completely different galaxy when it comes to difficulty, but we'll get there. If this game was truly meant to be extremely difficult, then how did stuff like this slip through the cracks? On a more positive note, an element that both games succeed in is giving each stage its own identity through unique level gimmicks and set pieces. In all my Kirby videos, I've made it no secret that I think one of that series' greatest weaknesses is that the individual levels don't do enough to stand out from each other aside from maybe the visual design. The two subjects of this video, though, do not have this issue. Each stage in either of these games has its own identity in not just the backgrounds, but also the mechanics and gimmicks within each stage. It's easy to tell Ground Man's stage from Tengu Man's stage, it's easy to tell Inami Temple from North Pole area, etc. Nevertheless, while X6's stages do change things up, they ultimately give off the feeling of being underdeveloped in some way or another. I touched upon this earlier, but a couple of stages feel incredibly short, at least when you're going for the boss fight at the end. Laser Institute is only a few rooms worth of mirror puzzles before you reach Sheldon himself, and Weapon Center is literally just a brief straight line with enemies and lasers chasing you. Other stages have different issues that cause them to feel unfinished. The novelty of Central Museum sending you to unique rooms fades quickly when you realize that all of these rooms largely consist of nightmare viruses copy-pasted over and over and rock training down with little rhyme or reason. Magma area seems like it has potential with fire hazards to avoid, but the stage quickly deteriorates into fighting the same Nightmare Snake mini-boss over and over. While each mini-boss in this stage has a somewhat different pattern, fighting giant mechanical donuts repeatedly with practically no gameplay in between gets old quickly, especially when you realize that you could dispose of them effortlessly by nuking the stream repeatedly with one of your weapons. A few levels are decently long and push their mechanics well enough, but I can't say that they're the majority. The levels do have alternate paths to make them larger and to push the stage gimmicks further, but since they can't be exited from the pause menu whatsoever and don't lead you to the main boss, they end up loading the game to an annoying degree. As much credit as I'll give X6 for the ideas in the levels, that doesn't stop them from being shamefully anemic. Mega Man and Bass fares far better in this regard. While I mentioned that the intro stage can be tricky for first-time players, I still applaud it for being full of diverse set pieces rather than just being a straight shot with enemies like a lot of other Mega Man intro stages, and this trait carries over to the rest of the game. None of the main levels in this game come off as being laughably short, and the stage mechanics feel much more thought out. While X6 goes with the approach of using one core mechanic and maybe iterating upon it 3 or 4 times throughout the whole stage, which isn't necessarily a bad approach in concept, Mega Man and Bass shifts the mechanic in play from section to section within a level. They are iterated upon about as many times as in X6, but there tend to be more within a single level. Ground Man's stage utilizes these sand waterfalls, mukamukades, that you can either avoid or try to take down with your weaponry, unstable metal platforms, statues that you can only destroy a limited number of times, which acts like a neat puzzle element, and digmoles destroying the ground from under you all in one stage. Occasionally, there are set pieces that are more one-off, like the enemies bursting out of the wall in Astro Man's stage or the bubbles you use to progress in Pirate Man's stage, but they've got plenty of other elements at play to make up for them. There's a healthy balance between these mechanics, the more standard platforming and the combat sections. This is nice for keeping a player's interest since it means that none of the level mechanics overstay their welcome. The one Robot Master stage that I might consider a bit undercooked is Pirate Man's stage, which doesn't offer too much besides water physics and wall spikes, but it's only one level and not over half the entire selection, and it is a perfectly enjoyable level regardless. There may not be any alternate routes like in X6, but that's probably for the best since they came with their own set of problems in terms of padding, and the levels are an appropriate length without them. Probably the most subjective aspect of this discussion is whether or not the difficulty itself comes from the right places. Right off the bat, I'll point out that Mega Man and Bass returns you to the beginning of the stage, or stage select screen, if you get a game over, while X6 returns you to the last checkpoint, which is more lenient. Occasionally, MM&B will try to compensate for harder sections by giving you an infinitely responding extra life, and you're also allowed to buy even more extra life from the shop. E-tanks and rush adapters, though, are MIA in Mega Man and Bass. I suspect that this is the game's way of telling you to man up and actually take the game design for what it is, although Bass does get the ability to have Treble lend his power. Both of these games have upgrade systems actually, but the one in Mega Man X6 is set up in a way where it's possible to forever lose upgrades since the injured Reploids carrying them can become infected. While this situation can be avoided, any possibility for collectibles to be forever gated off from your save file is something that, in my opinion, should never be allowed. There are also the X-Stable heart containers, tanks, and armor pieces, but unfortunately they're too often pitifully easy to get. The in-stage collectibles of Mega Man and Base, meanwhile, are CDs that actually carry over between save files, and they're placed in a way that incentivizes exploration as well as the use of a specific maneuver or special weapon. But what about the actual level design? In terms of the enemy placement, I will concede that Mega Man and Base is pretty rough around the edges. There's this one part of Cold Man's stage that always gets me for some reason, with monopellons, breakable platforms, and spikes beneath your feet, and there are some instances where it feels like the amount of enemies is pretty overwhelming. There are also a couple of cannons in Burner Man's stage that can get in the way when you're just trying to avoid getting burned alive. However, most of this is stuff that's manageable if you approach it the right way. Sometimes you'll need to take a step back to observe what's going on, but other times you'll need to be more brave. Special weapons can also help a lot in sections like these. In terms of pure platforming, Mega Man and Base is similarly nothing you can't overcome without persistence. Generally speaking, whenever a level introduces a new stage mechanic, it does so organically, starting off with a relatively safe application and later using it in more lethal ways. Having platforms that you fall through or dark rooms with only a scrolling light when spikes are involved may seem cheap at first glance, but since they were shown to you previously in rooms without spikes, you probably have a good idea how they work and how to best deal with them. I've heard horror stories about this one part of Tengu Man's stage where you need to jump onto an off-screen balloon, but I don't know, once you know it's there, the section basically beats itself. I honestly had more trouble with the Moko Moko modes right before. I've heard plenty of people say that Base is the only viable character since his dash and double jump make platforming way easier, but honestly there are parts of Base's playthrough where I always think to myself this would be a lot easier with Mega Man. While I'd agree to some extent that platforming is harder with Mega Man, none of it came off as anything I couldn't overcome or was skewed against me, aside from maybe one disappearing block section in the final castle stage and this one part of Dynamo Man's stage with the conveyor belts and needing to jump at the very edge. These are pretty specific examples that require me to kind of reach though. Bear in mind that I haven't played over half of the classic Mega Man series. I'm not exactly a series pro, just someone who wasn't about to give up on the game just because of the occasional mishap. With X6 though, it's a very different story. Sometimes the enemies overcrowding the screen amounts to just a nuisance in a similar vein to Mega Man and Base, but other times the enemy placement is downright stupid. In Recycle Lab, there are nightmare viruses placed upon paths that you need to get through as quickly as possible lest you get crushed, and these dinguses getting in the way can cause instant death. It's even worse than that one section of Burner Man's stage that people seem to have an issue with, since tanking hits isn't even a viable option. The unfair design doesn't stop with the enemy placements though. There are times where the camera simply doesn't like to show you the spikes that are right below you. Spikes placed in downward sections where you could easily fall in without seeing them were a rarity in Mega Man and Base. And while they aren't exactly everywhere in Mega Man X6, the places where it does happen are pretty egregious. But an even more obnoxious design choice is the nightmare effects. Basically how it works is that once you beat a level, additional hazards appear in a couple other levels. Maybe you could defend this by saying that it shakes up levels you've already played, but the issue is that these are hardly woven into the stages organically and just feel tacked on. Is there any real pattern to these burning meteors that works in tandem with these parts where you have to scale slippery slopes or avoid falling ice blocks? Does limiting the player's visibility work with a stage where you have to explore for tiny objects to progress? If the nightmare effects felt like they were actually part of the stage, I wouldn't be whining about it, and there are even a few that do, such as the blocks that appear in Recycle Lab when you beat Central Museum. All too often though, they just feel like they were slapped on at the last minute, and therefore fair game design hardly feels like a consideration. Then there are the final stages, which actually suffer from similar issues across both games. The first King stage in Mega Man and Base combines many mechanics from the previous stages to create perhaps the most difficult stage yet, although it felt like it was my fault whenever I died in this stage. The boss at the end is a different story. It's fairly decent overall with a unique balance scale setup, but in perhaps the cheapest moment in the entire game, you can die instantly if you kill the boss and stand on the scale for too long. It's something you can avoid if you know it's coming, but the fact that it can happen in the first place makes me wonder if this part was playtested. The second King stage includes a whopping 4 boss fights in it, and to say that sounds like a lot for one stage would be an understatement. The level sections in between the bosses though are short and easy and mostly there for you to refill your weapon energy. I feel like they should have refilled them automatically if they were gonna dance around the idea, but I'll take what I can get. What about the bosses themselves? King Tank definitely takes a while since there are 3 main sections you have to take down, but if you're careful and strategically use your special weapons, you can overcome it. King Jet is often considered to be the worst boss in the game since you're likely going to die from falling into the abyss below rather than taking damage. The problem is that when it fires its fists, it can destroy a platform that you intend to land on, but pro tip, whenever it uses the fist attack, whip out the lightning ability. It holds you in place in midair, which can be a failsafe in case the platform beneath you gets destroyed. You're welcome. King himself gave me a lot of trouble until I realized that you're not supposed to attack in the first part and just avoid the X attacks. After that, the lightning bolt should make quick work of him, which is admittedly lame. Jet King Robo is probably the best boss in the stage, combining patterns from the previous forms into a battle that's challenging but manageable and shouldn't take too long. After beating the final King stage boss, you're on your way to reach Dr. Wily. This final stage consists of the boss rush alongside Dr. Wily himself, and I think putting the final boss in the same stage as the boss rush in a game where dying too many times puts you at the start of the stage is overkill. What other people consider overkill is how there are level sections in between each boss fight, but I think this deserves some credit. Having to fight 8 bosses back to back with nothing in between in most other Mega Man games is pretty exhausting in my opinion, so breaking it up with mild platforming and opportunities to refill your weapons is nice. With that, we have the face-off with Wily himself, and his boss fight isn't too bad. You'll probably die a few times, especially since his capsule form likes to spawn out of Mega Man's range, but all the attacks are perfectly dodgeable if you can react in time. Overall, the King stages have their share of unfair moments, no doubt, but the majority is manageable if you put your skills that you've learned over the course of the game to good use. No, if you want final stages with design and bosses that are jarring no matter how you slice it, then Mega Man X6 steals the show. From the very start, there's a section that has no other purpose than to be impossible if you just happen to go in with the wrong configuration. Getting into this stage with X requires either the shadow armor or the jumper part, which are convoluted to get in the first place, but I'll spare you the details. Zero can bypass this section with ease thanks to his double jump, but the boss here, heh. I've beaten this boss a half dozen times as X and could hardly leave a dent in it as Zero. Oh, and you think the one part of MM&B where you fall into the lava is bad? Well, there's this one section where your controls are locked for a few seconds while fire rises to consume you. If you don't know that your controls are unlocked a second before, then you die instantly. The second stage suffers from the same issue as MM&B in terms of cramming in too much content, but the content itself is 10 times worse. Sure, the first section tries to present a decent challenge with having to defeat these totem poles while on moving platforms, but it's constantly interrupted with enemies that dash in out of nowhere. After the first boss fight, there's a second section that changes depending on whether you're playing as X or Zero, but I don't think either section is all that bad of a level. Zero's Crusher section is actually even easier than Metal Shark Player's stage. With X's section though, there's one section that can't even be beaten with the shadow armor without certain upgrades, and if you just happen to be wearing it, then you'll just have to leave the level and later put up with the totem pole section and high max all over again. Shame on you for not knowing this ahead of time. This isn't difficulty, this is just needlessly dragging out the game. The first of this stage's boss fights, High Max, drags even worse than King Tank since his attacks are a lot more repetitive and, depending on your chosen character, even getting the chance to hit him involves more waiting. Once he does give you the chance, you have to use a charged shot followed by his special weapon, which just feels cumbersome and an inorganic way of incentivizing the player to use special weapons. Even when you know what you're doing, it still feels tedious. Gate himself is a pretty jerkish capstone to this already jerkish stage. You defeat him by destroying these orbs he throws and getting one of the 6 shots it splits into to hit Gate himself, but there seems to be no pattern to get him to even use the orb attacks. Sometimes he'll hand them out like candy on Halloween, while other times he spends a minute refusing to use them at all. I'm experienced enough to have a strategy on how to deal with the orbs when he does toss them out, but even experience can't stop this battle from taking forever. It just feels like luck, not true challenge. The third stage consists of the boss rush, pretty much just going for the same approach as most other Mega Man games, which I find exhausting as I've said, followed by what's basically a straight line with enemies, and finally Sigma himself. I don't have much to say here. The first phase is really easy, but the second phase can hit pretty hard. It's probably the best fight in the final stages, although that's not saying a whole lot. You might have noticed that I mostly skimmed over the King bosses while lingering on the Gate bosses, but that's just because there are fewer aspects of the King bosses that I can point to as bad game design. With all that covered, we've reached our conclusion. Which of these is the superior game? Well, you probably know which one I think is better at this point, but despite how much I've torn into Mega Man X6, I really can't say that I hate it. At this point, I know the game's designed so well that I can bend it to my will and have a fun time while doing so. I didn't have to make this video, and I probably wouldn't have if I thought that X6 was the most unenjoyable Mega Man game ever. I'd take it over X7 in a heartbeat for what that's worth. Regardless, even though I can enjoy both Mega Man X6 and Mega Man and Bass, in X6 there are gaping issues with the design around so many corners, be it the unfinished stages, the unbalanced bosses, the unwieldy nightmare system, and the needless padding. There are other things that I could have gone into, such as the unsatisfying special weapons or a tacky presentation, minus the music, but I think I've stated my case well enough as it is. There is a difficulty selection that lets you make the game easier to overcome, but it really doesn't fix the game. The problems with this game go beyond poor enemy placement and cheap deaths, and it's because of all this that I don't agree with the notion that people only hate it because they can't handle the difficulty. Many of this game's problems don't necessarily make the game harder so much as make it more obnoxious to play. I hoped that comparing it to another game that's garnered similar criticisms would put that into perspective. At the end of the day, X6 is a game I can enjoy playing and even look forward to revisiting, but if the intent was to make a game with a satisfying challenge, then I'd have to say they failed. Mega Man and Bass, however, is far more successful and consistent than X6 in many areas, including its endeavor to make a game that tests your ultimate Mega Man skills. If you have plenty of experience with the Mega Man titles and are looking for a challenge, then I'd say there's a legitimately worthwhile game in here with a level of difficulty that's actually, in my opinion, satisfying instead of purely frustrating like many people seem to suggest. I won't try to deny that I tried stomping my chair into the ground at least once during my recording session, but after beating it, I nonetheless feel like I overcame a great feat rather than just getting lucky. I mean, I was able to conquer it, and I haven't even beaten half the classic Mega Man games as I previously mentioned. Even if you do take issue with the game's difficulty and think that this entire video is just me excusing poor design, I'm of the opinion that a truly bad game isn't the result of one game-breaking issue, but several issues compounded onto each other, and I firmly believe that Mega Man and Bass does not fall into the latter category. Pretty much every other aspect of the game besides the difficulty is very well done and elevates it to being a very pleasant Mega Man game, and the difficulty itself is better handled than a lot of people give it credit for, as I've explained. All the defense I've heard thrown X6's way can apply to Mega Man and Bass and then some, because in the end, it was indeed supposed to be hard. Thanks for watching, fellas. If you have any requests for future videos, comment to let me know. Just don't expect more Mega Man for a while though. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this shakeup from the typical reviews because I'm actually thinking of doing something similar for next time.